Hello and welcome to our midweek meditations. I'm Victor Kim, the lead minister at Richmond Presbyterian Church. Here we are on this beautiful day out in the garden of one of our parishioners, and I'm grateful to be recording this meditation from such a beautiful location. This is part of our summer series of midweek meditations called Summer Staycation Sermons. And because we're not traveling, most of us aren't traveling very far this summer, I want to take you on a bit of a tour of some of the gardens and some of the mountains in Scripture. And this week, I want to focus on what's called the Garden of Deceit. The Garden of Deceit. Now, you might wonder, what garden and deceit? Well, those two words don't really go together very often. Gardening is such a nice and gentle and benign thing. Why would we put the word garden and deceit together? Well, maybe it could go together if you're stealing your neighbor's geraniums, or in some cases I hear that some people get so fed up with their neighbors not doing anything about their weed problem that they will go and surreptitiously spray weed killer on their neighbor's gardens or their neighbor's dandelions. But you know what? The words garden and deceit can go together because, like gardening, deceit isn't something that just happens by accident. It's something that needs to be cultivated. Deceit is something that needs to be cultivated. So how does one cultivate deceit? Let me tell you a story about one of the kings of Israel. We find this story in the book of 1 Kings in the 21st chapter in the Old Testament. But let me tell you about a king named Ahab. And there's a lot about Ahab that I could tell you about, but I just want to tell you one little thing about him, one story about him. So Ahab's a king. He lives in his palace, and I suppose it's good to be king. You get to live anywhere you want, and I'm sure his palace was a beautiful palace. And one day, as he was wandering around his palace, he was looking down from the walls of his palace, and he saw a little vineyard that belonged to one of the subjects of his kingdom, a man called Naboth. And this garden was a beautiful little garden, and Naboth saw it, and Ahab saw it, and he decided, I want that garden. It looks like it'd be a good garden for me to grow my vegetables, and I want that garden. So he decided that he would go and talk to Naboth about getting that garden from him. Now, this is the first seed that gets planted, right? Ahab sees something that doesn't belong to him, and now he wants it. And he goes to Naboth and says to Naboth, hey Naboth, you know your garden? I really like your garden. I'd like to buy it from you. Seems like a fair enough proposition. You know what? I'll give you a better garden somewhere in a different location if you want, or I'll just give you the value for your garden in money. Again, sounds fair, doesn't it? Well, for Naboth, it's not really as simple as that, because for Naboth and every other Israelite, the garden, the land that this garden is planted in, it's his identity, right? It's his identity. This land, they believe, was given to them by God as a sign of the covenant that God had made with his people. Every family, every tribe of the nation of Israel was given their piece of property when the Israelites entered into Canaan many, many years ago. And you just don't sell your land. You don't even sell your land to the king. It's like you'd be selling your birthright, your identity, your heritage. And a Jewish person without a land would essentially become an outcast, right? You could use your land as collateral. You could even have your land taken over by others if you couldn't pay your debt. However, every 50 years in what they called the year of the Jubilee, all of the land would return back to its rightful ancestral owners. So if you could avoid it, you would never sell your land. So for Ahab, the king, to ask Naboth to sell his land was akin to asking Naboth to denounce his God, to denounce his very identity. It's something that Ahab, as the king of Israel, should have known, right? He should know better than to ask one of his subjects to give up that very thing which symbolizes his covenant with God, or God's covenant with them. Naboth could have had any property that was available to a king, but he wanted something that didn't belong to him. And it's not just about planting seeds, right? It's not just about Ahab seeing what wasn't his and wanting it. you've also got to water what's been planted, right? You've got to cultivate this deceit. Once Ahab makes the decision to obsess about what's not his, once he makes that decision to take what doesn't belong to him, he needs to water and fertilize that decision. So Ahab goes home and he's sulking in his bed, churning his face away, and he wouldn't eat anything. And so what happens is Ahab makes himself the victim. Oh, Naboth churned me down. I gave him a reasonable offer and he churned me down. Poor me, right? So he complains to his wife, Jezebel. And Jezebel sees Ahab for the weak man that he is. So Jezebel, the queen, creates this ruse in which Naboth is invited to this gathering. And in this gathering, Naboth, who is supposed to be honored, suddenly is churned upon. And the queen arranges so that Naboth is basically accused of treason, of doing something against the king. And then he becomes the victim of a stoning. It's a really well-planned act of deceit and treachery. And once the deed is done, and once Naboth has been stoned, Jezebel goes back to Ahab and says, look, Naboth is dead. You can have the garden. Go and take possession of the vineyard. And as soon as he heard that Naboth was dead, Ahab, no questions asked, rushes to go and take possession of it. You can't just plant seeds if you're going to cultivate a garden of deceit. You've got to water it. You've got to fertilize it. And we all know what fertilizer smells like, right? The stench of deceit does not escape the notice of God. It doesn't escape the notice of God. And God sent his prophet Elijah to confront Ahab about his deceit. And he convicted Ahab of the crime of killing Naboth. And he prophesied to Ahab that the very place that Naboth's blood was spilled would be the same place that Ahab's own blood would be spilled, and the dogs would lick up that blood. Because you've sold yourself to what is evil in the sight of the Lord, I will bring disaster upon you, is what Elijah said to Ahab. If there's good news about gardens of deceit, it is that deceit does not fall outside the knowledge and the concern of God. Our God is a God of justice, a God of righteousness, and there will be judgment on those who cultivate deceit. Now, there's another story in the Bible that's really similar to this story of Ahab and Naboth, and that's the story of David and Bathsheba. David's another king who looks upon something that doesn't belong to him. In this case, he looks upon a person, Bathsheba. He sees her from his palace, and he wants something that doesn't belong to him, and he arranges to have Bathsheba brought to him. Of course, he finds out that Bathsheba is married to a man named Uriah, one of his faithful soldiers, and he arranges to have Uriah brought back so that Uriah could sleep with Bathsheba, because by then David has already slept with her and she's pregnant with their child. And when he cannot get Uriah to sleep with his wife, he arranges to have Uriah murdered, basically killed on the battlefield, so that he can then take Bathsheba to be his own wife. And again, that deceit does not go unnoticed by God, who sends in the prophet Nathan, who confronts David and says, you are the man. And David is confronted by this awful truth of what he had done. Now, both David and Ahab have been confronted by God's prophets, by Nathan and by Elijah. But what makes David a man after God's own heart eventually is that David knows what he's done. He understands the enormity of the sin that he's committed, and he basically confesses and says, I've done a terrible, terrible thing, and he begs God for forgiveness. Now, Ahab is completely different. He feels a little bit bad about this. But after a period of mourning, when Ahab goes around dejectedly, his life continues as if nothing really happened. And ultimately, Ahab joins with a king called Jehoshaphat. At that time, the kingdom of Israel was divided into the northern kingdom, which Ahab was the king of, called Israel, in the southern kingdom of Judah, where Jehoshaphat was the king. And the two of them joined to fight a battle against another king. But Ahab, being the deceitful kind of guy that he is, he disguises himself in battle. He doesn't want to wear the king's robes. And he encourages Jehoshaphat to wear his king's robes. So in this ensuing battle, Jehoshaphat, as the king, even though they were defeated, he was spared because he was the king. But Ahab, because he wasn't dressed like a king, he was mistakenly killed by one of the enemy archers. So ultimately, his deceit catches up to him, and Ahab meets his well-deserved fate, his well-deserved end. You know, what David's story tells us is that healing can happen if we're convicted of our deceit and turn our lives around. Or, like Ahab, we can end up reaping the consequences of our deceit. But healing also happens when God's people speak up and act and speak prophetically to confront deceit and to advocate for the poor and for the powerless. Both Nathan, in the case of David, and Elijah, in the case of Ahab, put their lives on the line to speak truth to power, to confront the deceit of the king, to speak of God's anger and displeasure with what the kings had done. You know, I think we live in a culture where too many good people do nothing about the deceit that we see being cultivated all around us, because it's hard to be a voice for God's righteousness and God's justice when it calls us to put ourselves on the line, right? It's a lot easier to just go along with what everybody else is doing. But God calls people like you and I to speak prophetically, to speak courageously, to speak truth to power. God always sides with the oppressed, with the poor and the powerless. God sides with those who are deceived, used up, spit out, treated as expendable. God chooses sides, and when it comes to deceit, there is no neutral ground. The garden of deceit must be cultivated, but so would those voices that would speak prophetically against that deceit. We must cultivate these voices within ourselves. Greed and self-centeredness are pervasive in our world. We know that, especially among those who have power over others. The story of Ahab and Naboth is a constant reminder to us that we have responsibilities to those who are less able than us to defend themselves and care for themselves. We need to speak about God's prophetic justice, where injustice rules, and that sort of justice needs to be cultivated as well. Think about where the story of Naboth's garden, where the poor are being exploited and oppressed, where is that being lived out today? Where is that being lived out today? And think about whether we as the church or we as individuals are being called by God to speak prophetically against these gardens of deceit. You know, as we finish this brief meditation, I just pray that this prophetic voice in you and in me may be cultivated, that we would flourish in a garden as beautiful as the one behind me, a garden of truth and justice, and that you and in me, in us, that God will find a voice that God will use to confront those who seek to be deceitful, and that in doing so, that others may find healing, comfort, and hope. Thanks be to God. God be with you. Friends, we're delighted to have with us again today Graeme Stager. Of course, Graeme, many of you will know, is our recently retired music director. And he's been filling in for Gianni Berdetti, our music director, who's on holidays. And this will be the last of Graeme's midweek meditations. He'll be with us this coming Sunday as well. So just want to thank Graeme for his willingness to participate and be part of these meditations. And I just want to invite you to listen to what Graeme has prepared as a musical meditation. And I just want to wish you God's love and God's peace, God's justice, and to encourage you to be those prophetic voices that will speak out against deceit and injustice in our world. Have a great week, and may God always be with you and bless you. Amen.